What up, Wizards? It's Dev. Mtg, we like it a magic, and big news yesterday, in case you hadn't heard. Now, Worlds is coming up this weekend, in case you hadn't heard that either. The World Championships start on Friday, and a lot of people are hyped about this one for good reason. It's the first Worlds in 2 years. We didn't get a Worlds last year. And it seems like they're doing it at the right time. It's just a few weeks after a set came out, so this will really help inform and solidify the meta moving forward past this event. The only problem is all the deck lists for Worlds leaked Tuesday on Twitter. So people have been having a field day, myself included, sort of dissecting these decks, going over individual card choices and individual decks, but also talking about sort of the overall effect that the meta of the World Championships is going to have on the meta at large. And I am no different, of course. I like having content to do as much as the next guy, and I think it's obviously a really valuable exercise to go through these decks, talk about why the competitors chose them in the first place, individual card choices, how this affects the meta moving forward, and any potential decisions that may come down from upstairs as a result of this event and the meta moving forward. So let's go ahead and get to it and talk about these 6 decks. Among 16 competitors, there are 6 decks, and there are really only 4 decks, and then 2 kind of homebrewy offshoots that 2 players are playing. But a lot of these decks that showed up at this event are well represented by a large number of the players in the event. Like, for instance, we'll start with Grixis Epiphany, and 25% of the players at the event, 4 out of 16, are all on a functionally identical version of this deck. So I'll show you Gabriel Nassif's version because everybody loves Gabe Nassif. You may know him better as Yellow Hat, but everybody loves Gabe. So we're going to look at his version of the deck because it's basically the same as his teammates. I'm going to put a question mark next to that, but Eli Cassis, Jan Merkel, and Matt Sperling are all on this version of the deck along with Gabe. Now, the key card in this deck is obviously Alrund's Epiphany. Right? It's called Grixis Epiphany, and 10 of the 16 players in this event showed up with copies of Alrund's Epiphany in their deck. If you want it, it's actually closer to 9, and then there's 1 copy in the blue-white Azorius Tempo deck, but there's a bunch of Izzet Epiphany and Grixis Epiphany lists at this tournament, and Alrund's Epiphany is easily the most represented card at the event. And one of the big tricks in both this and the Izzet Epiphany deck is Alrund's Epiphany in Galvanic Iteration, which you've probably seen before already on Arena. This is getting really, really popular to do. I do like that multiple cards in this deck just make it look like you're reading off like my sleepers list. Other cards that I thought were going to be good and like nobody else liked. But I was specifically worried about Galvanic Iteration and Alrund's Epiphany, and it is definitely like the thing to do in the format at this point. You know, if 1 Alrund's Epiphany isn't enough, how's about 2 or 3? And then you start chaining them, and it's just the most powerful thing you can be doing in this format. So I'm not surprised that Alrund's Epiphany is so well represented. It was already in like Standard 2022 and before in Sultai Ultimatum and whatnot. It was already one of the most powerful cards in Standard. So I'm not surprised that now that we get to copy it with a card that we don't even have to have in our hands, it's probably the best card in the entire format, more or less hands down. But Galvanic Iteration can obviously copy all kinds of other stuff. You want to save it for your iteration, or not your iteration, your Epiphany, most of the time. But if you need to take out 2 creatures or whatever, there's plenty of ways to use a Galvanic Iteration, knowing that it's just going to go into your graveyard and you can use it later when you want to cast the Epiphany and copy it. Now, one trick that you can't do, I want you to remember that you cannot do this, is copying a Memory Deluge with a Galvanic Iteration. This is a trap a lot of people have fallen into, but, you know, when you cast a copy, you didn't spend any mana on the copy, so you don't look at any cards, and you don't put any cards in your hand. So keep that in mind. If you want to, like, flashback a Memory Deluge and Galvanic Iteration it sounds awesome, but you can't. You can't do it. I mean, the game will let you try, and you won't look at any cards with Memory Deluge. Just keep that in mind. But there's a bunch of other cards in this deck that look really funky. And again, some cards that ended up on my sleepers list, like the Celestis. Of all things, this is really cool card advantage. And it does end up being card advantage. Once you get the real key card in the deck down, this becomes card advantage because you can discard things and play them out of your graveyard. You can just discard stuff with flashback to it. Right, gains you a little bit of life over the course of the game and loots for you. So, and it even ramps. It gets you to Alrund's Epiphany a turn early, which is really important. And obviously, the Epiphany Galvanic Iteration combo costs like all the mana in the world. So, it's nice to have a little bit of ramp in a blue deck that doesn't really play counter spells in the first place. You don't really care about holding up mana too much on turn 3, especially against other control decks, of which there were expected to be a lot at this event, and there are. So you don't mind spending 3 mana on a Celestis because your opponent's probably not going to resolve a super important permanent on the next turn. Right, so this is a really interesting pick that is extremely meta dependent, but this can obviously grind out a ton of value over a long game. So I'm totally into the inclusion of Celestis. And what did I say a million times? I don't even think this is going to be in a day-night deck. This is going to be in a control deck that can take advantage of the value. It's exactly what we're seeing here. But another card that I thought was weird, but I definitely thought had a lot of potential was Liar. And it definitely, it has not made a liar out of me. This card is in all 4 of these Grixis lists as a 3 of, and this is one of the big reasons that we're not playing counterspells in the deck, at least main deck counterspells, and even the sideboard counterspells are very limited. You see there's only 4 Malevolent Hermit, and that's all. That's it. So, Liar is... The way this is going to work most of the time is that you'll play it on 6 or 7 mana, but this deck usually can hold out until it gets that much mana. That's the whole game plan, right? You're trying to cast Epiphany for 6 or 7 mana, copy it for 2 or 3 extra mana. So sometimes you need 10 mana in this deck to do the things you want to do. The deck already wants a lot of mana, so having Lear in the deck, or Liar, is awesome. Right? Because if you're getting to that much mana anyway, you can drop Liar into open mana and then go ahead and get value out of her, which is really, really sweet, right? Like, let's say your opponent tries to kill your Liar, where you can't counterspell that because spells can't be countered if you have a Liar out. But you can Fading Hope the Liar back to your hand to protect it. That's actually pretty sweet, right? You can Memory Deluge out of your yard for 4 mana if you have extra open mana and try to find something to protect it. You can try to find the Fading Hope off the top of your deck, for instance. Just a lot of cool little tricks like that. And the spell suite here is really interesting outside of, the spells the deck has to play, like Epiphany and Galvanic Iteration. You see some stuff that's really meta dependent here. The one main deck, Cinderclasm against mono white mostly. But there's a bunch of silver bullets. Prismari Command, which is also a thing that can provide treasure, ramp us into an Alrund's Epiphany. We can dump cards into our graveyard. Like, the presence of Galvanic Iteration in the deck makes the draw 2 discard mode much, much better, a little bit more palatable, right? And Liar in the deck makes this much, much better. You can dump cards in your graveyard and just cast them later. So, 1 Prismari Command in the deck, and I'm surprised it's not more, especially this card is really bumped up in terms of price lately. A Prismari Command's like $850 right now, which is unbelievable. But there's also Demon Bolt, which you don't see every day. This is because 4 damage is an important threshold against mostly mono green, right? You see Esseka's Chariots, 4 toughness, Trolls, 4 toughness, and a bunch of other stuff that you really need 4 damage rather than like 3 from Frostbite or something. So you see Demon Bolt in here, and when it only costs you 1 mana, it's really good. It's quite good. Cathartic Pyre is just a 1-of in the deck. Again, you can discard things to this and not really care as much, or it can be a removal piece against mono white. But again, in like mirror matches, it helps you too. So really sweet inclusion here. And then a Power Word Kill to blow up stuff. Not everything, but there's fewer Goldspan Dragons in this format now. Because Grixis Epiphany doesn't play it. Izzet Epiphany doesn't play Goldspan anymore in the main deck. So never thought we'd see the day, but here we are. So, outside of Faceless Haven, this blows up most of the important creatures in Standard. We're just playing the 1. This deck can play more 1-ofs because it can cast a spell and then just cast it again later off of Liar. So, you don't have to play like 2 or 3 of a kind of a niche situational card. You can just play 1, and if you need it in a specific matchup, you'll get it twice in that game, so long as you draw it the once. So that's pretty cool. Outside of that, there's also Smoldering Egg, number 1 on my sleepers list, baby, and every single one of these plays 1 of, but the Izzet Epiphany list will sometimes play 4 copies of this card. It's kind of like their thing in the ice. And especially in a deck with this many instants and sorceries. The card transforms really fast and can just be an alternate win condition in a lot of cases. So, Smoldering Egg, sweet, but obviously just 1-of sweet in these Grixis lists. There's also a bunch of other stuff that you might expect to see. The 1 copy of Bloodchief's Thirst can take out creatures in mono white, but can also kill Wrenn and 7 Very important. Duress can take things like Ren and 7 and Eska's Chariot out of our opponent's hand, but it can also take Alrund's Epiphanies and stuff. We get our Lyre down, we can play Lyre, and then with just one extra mana, we can duress the opponent and try to get important stuff out of their hand. That could kill the Lyre or whatever. So that's a cool play this deck can make. Obviously for expressive iterations, don't leave home without it if you're playing blue-red in your deck, right? But there's a bunch of other stuff in here that I really like. You know, Draw Disruption, a land or a pre-Lyre counterspell. A lot of Draw Disruption in this event, by the way. And then I guess the only thing in this deck, main deck, that I haven't talked about is Burn Down the House, which is an important sweeper, but again, we didn't expect too much aggro at this event. So one main deck Burn Down the House actually makes a great deal of sense. And against other control decks, it's never dead. You can make some bodies off of it, which is pretty sweet. And then Spikefield Hazard, pretty well represented at this event too. This is great against mono white because it kills, Luminarch Aspirants before they get a counter. Before they put a counter on anything. It kills Elite Spellbinders. It kills Prosperous Innkeeper, Shambling Ghasts without them getting the dice trigger, even the occasional eye twitch or whatever. This just kills a very high number of important and played creatures in the format right now, so I'm not surprised to see a couple of copies of that. I want to quickly point out the lands here, just because I think that Grixis was helped a great deal, an underestimated amount, by the new lands in this set. Note that there's 3 Shipwreck Marsh and 4 Haunted Ridge in this deck, right? These 3-color wedges, basically enemy color, 3-color combinations, really got a ton of help. I say enemy color, but black is aligned with red, blue is aligned with black, so it's not necessary. Anyway, wedges. Not shards, but wedges. These all got a lot of help because they both got 2 new dual lands that come into play untapped starting on turn 3. So it's really good for control decks. So I don't think that, let me put it this way. These dual lands, in large part, I think help this deck become a thing. Let me put it that way, because the mana is so much better now than it was. As far as the sideboard goes, you've got Mind Flayer against mostly mono white because they can't really do much about Mind Flayer. You just take one of their creatures and they can't Skyclave Apparition it because it costs too much. Flayer does. So there's just not really much removal. If your opponent has already played like their Blizzard Brawl or something, then it's really not a big deal to grab something against mono green either, because they don't often have too much removal. There's also the idea that, after sideboards, you can side in creatures because your opponent is going to side out their removal in a lot of cases. So if you side in Mind Flayer, you might catch them flat-footed with less removal spells than they had in game 1. So that's a big deal too, and sometimes this might even matter in mirror matches. We see Goldspan Dragons and stuff in some of these Izzet sideboards. So in game 2, they side in their Goldspan Dragon. You sided your Mind Flayer knowing that they probably sided out some removal against you. So, there's some cool uses for Flayer that I really like. Unexpected Windfall is very, very present in the Izzet list. Not so much in the Epiphany list, but it is important. We see a lot of it in this format because this can get you to the Epiphany quicker. And in this deck, obviously, you can recast things with Lyre that you discard to discard, right? If you copy it with a Galvanic Iteration or something like that, then you don't have to discard to cast the copy. So there's a lot of cool little tricks with Unexpected Windfall. Malevolent Hermit is in there, Tempo Tool. Cyclone Summoner, kind of a sweeper that's also a huge body, pretty good against the aggro lists. Duress also can return things like Eska's Chariot to their hand, returns Ren and 7 to their hand, gets rid of all the tokens on the battlefield, which is important against mono greens. So a lot of uses for Cyclone Summoner. Another copy of Duress, a copy of Soul Shatter in there against Planeswalkers for the most part. Power Word Kill for more removal, and then 2 Go Blank, which is actually, I think, almost a main deckable card in this format, but no main decks found room for Go Blank. But I think this is actually an extremely important card, especially in the mirror, obviously. Now, there's, of course, I've mentioned it a couple of times, but there's another Epiphany deck at this tournament, and it's just Izzet Epiphany. It doesn't have to worry so much about 3 colors of mana, and to be honest, the Black Splash may not be entirely necessary, but it does afford you better removal, discard spells like Duress that can be very important, especially in mirrors and stuff. So it's up to you, but if you want the better mana, you're probably going to go with Izzet Epiphany, and it does look like a very powerful deck. Now we're looking at Strasky's version of the deck, which is interesting because he was actually going to play a different deck before this event, but decided to go with the rest of his team before the event started. He was going to play Blue-Black Demi-Lich, and that deck looks awesome. But I guess he made what is probably the wise choice here, and went with Izzet Epiphany because it's really, really good. It's a fantastic deck. I mean, we've got Alrund's Epiphany. You probably expected that. Expressive iteration, but only 3. I don't know if you expected that, but you definitely expected to see the card one way or the other. Burn down the house, great removal spell, right? I mean, this deck hopes to, I guess, play more sweepers in the main deck, especially because it doesn't have a card like Liar to be able to replay its removal in the late game or anything. So more main deck sweepers, and the deck probably does need a little bit more help against decks like Mono White because it doesn't have as many, great early game removal options or anything like that. Blood Chief's Thirst doesn't have access to that. So it makes sense that we would just wait till turn 5 and sweep the board. But we're also playing Spikefield Hazard, take out all those, X1s that I was talking about earlier. Fading Hope, still a very important card, even without a card like Liar in the deck, just because of the tempo this provides at such a cheap cost, and the scry can be very important, especially against aggro decks. So, you're looking for the sweeper, you're looking for your land drops, you can cast the sweep or cast the next removal spell or whatever. So, Fading Hope is just the best unsummon ever printed. I think it's much better than Vapor Snag even. Fading Hope is a very, very good Magic card. But aside from that, Unexpected Windfall, all 4 copies of this. The deck is looking to try and make a ton of mana because it's got 4 Galvanic Iteration and 4 Alrund's Epiphany. Why did I forget the name of that card? It's got 4, iterations, 4 Epiphanies. So the deck is going to be looking to make anywhere between 8 and 10 mana on some turns. So Unexpected Windfall helps it do that, and you can obviously dump a Galvanic Iteration in the yard. It's not as big a deal. And I didn't mention this with the Grixis deck, but in both this version of the deck and the Grixis deck, there are a lot of sort of matchup dependent 1 and 2 ofs in the deck. So there's some cards that, depending on what matchup you're in, you can just get rid of. Like, you don't care. You can just discard those cards. They're not going to matter. You can try and draw 2 fresh, better cards for the matchup. So that matters too. Now, all the Izzet decks are playing some number of Divide by Zero. This card has crept its way into best of 3. It probably always was the best of the Lesson cards. It turns out Instant Speed Lesson is like really, really good. Especially one that's doing like a Remand impression is fantastic. So in this version of the deck, you can go and get Teachings of the Archaics to draw some cards. Let me put that on screen. You can get Teachings of the Archaics to draw some cards. You can get Environmental Sciences to get lands and gain some life, which is often an important function of the card. And then Mascot Exhibition you can go grab just to explode in terms of board state. It's good after a sweeper. It's good to respond to your opponent's board state. So Mascot Exhibition is actually a really, really powerful card, whether you're in best of 1 or best of 3. It turns out Exhibition is just good, just a good card. So this deck doesn't go all the way and put like 7 lessons in. It just puts in the 3 best lessons that it could play. Even though the deck plays Unexpected Windfall, it also plays 2 Memory Deluge, because it's just the best card drawing spell in the entire format right now. 3 copies of Jwari Disruption, a little bit of main deck counter spells along with Test of Talents. Really good in the mirror. You just blow out Alrund's Epiphany and take all their copies and they scoop. Even if they're able to copy Alrund's Epiphany and get like 1 extra turn, just you Test of Talentsing their Alrunds and them never being able to cast it again is usually game, but there's a bunch of other stuff that Test of Talents can target on the stack that matters. Demon Bolt also shows up in this deck. It's fairly well represented in this tournament was Demon Bolt, but some decks will play 1, some decks will play 2. Kind of all depends on your matchup against Mono Green, and this deck needs it. We got to beat Essica's Chariot, we got to beat Troll, and we got to beat stuff like, Luminarch Aspirant put 2 counters on this guy, and now it has 4 toughness, so we got to beat that, right? So Demon Bolt makes a little bit of sense, and sometimes in the early game, you go ahead and foretell this, and then later you can squeeze it in as part of a double spell kind of thing, You can have mana to counter a spell with a Draw Disruption and still bolt something, so just this costing only 1 mana on occasion matters greatly. Aside from that, not really much to talk about with this deck. Hall of Storm Giants is another win condition the deck needs. Win conditions? Because if you haven't noticed, it doesn't really have a whole lot. It's just looking to get over with birds and win the game that way. Chain together like 3 or 4 copies of Epiphany. You just win because you have 4 birds and you get to swing like 4 times in a row. So that's 16 damage or whatever. So, the deck wins that way a lot. And the deck can also win with Hall of Storm Giants. Wait for your opponent to tap out or something. And then you can Alrund's Epiphany on the last turn, get in with Hall of Storm Giants, win the game. So, silly card, Hall of Storm Giants has turned out to be. But in the sideboard, you've got a couple of copies of Goldspan Dragon. This is, again, like I was saying before, a lot of people will side out removal against you because you don't play creatures. Removal is kind of almost useless against you, unless you want to take out Hall of Storm Giants or something. So a lot of people side out removal, you just bring in Goldspan, and it just does Goldspan things, and it helps you cast Epiphanies early and stuff like that. Another Spikefield Hazard in here for taking out Mono White Duders and whatnot. Burning Hands, which occasionally shows up in the main deck of these Izzet lists, because Mono Green is a really difficult matchup for us. Mono Green is probably the best deck against us based on what data I've seen so far for this format. So Burning Hands will sometimes show up as a 2 of in main decks, but at least the 3 of in the sideboard shore up that match a good bit. 3 Smoldering Eggs, again, is pretty good in mirror matches and whatnot. And it's another win condition in long games to help you close against those aggro decks and whatnot that have a little bit of resilience right now. Malevolent Hermit, again, with Malevolent Hermit, pretty decent mirror matches again. Especially in other decks that have against other decks that have counter spells, and you can get it on its other side, and they have to waste a removal spell on it. Again, especially good post sideboard when they've sided out some removal. Teachings of the Archaics, Test of Talents, another one of those in the mirrors, and then that's it. I've already talked about the lesson cards. So this deck is actually fairly simple in terms of all the players that played it, and there are a bunch. Stanislav Sivka is on this deck, Arnie Hushenbeth, Keisuke Saito, Andres Strosky, and Yuta Takahashi. However, Keisuke Saito and Yuta both have different kind of builds of the deck. Just looking here at Sato's build of the deck, you can tell that there's like way more spells and stuff in it. Like, you know, he's gone with one-ofs like Negate. We don't see that in the other builds of the deck, at least in the main. He's cut a Divide by 0 to make that. Burning Hands in the main deck here. A Saw It Coming, a main deck actual hard counter, which is missing from a lot of the other decks, surprisingly, right? And Into the Royal? What? You just don't see that every day. A Behold the Multiverse instead of Memory Deluge, right? 2 Cathartic Pyres. Some of these decks play 0 or 1, right? He's also playing 1 Disdainful Stroke main deck, which I actually think is brilliant. I think Disdainful Stroke is very main deckable right now, especially if the format keeps looking the way it does here. But, you know, do you main deck Test of Talents? Do you main deck Disdainful Stroke? Well, Disdainful Stroke picks up Chariot and Wrenn and 7. It doesn't blow out Alrund's Epiphany quite as much as a Test of Talents would, but it's got more play than a Test of Talents. You know, in your hand. So I really like the idea of one of main deck Disdainful Stroke, but in a lot of ways his deck is not that different from a lot of the other competitors on the deck. Now, Yuta's Izzet deck is different because he still believes in the power of the dragon. 4 main deck. Goldspan Dragons. Again, just not something you'd see every day. And instead of things like Demon Bolt, he's not playing any Demon Bolt main deck. Instead, Takahashi's playing Thundering Rebuke, which I think is actually an interesting call. Demon Bolt is a sorcery, or excuse me, Demon Bolt is an instant, whereas Thundering Rebuke is a sorcery. However, you're not holding up as often in decks like this, but I guess he is holding up in this deck. He's playing more main deck counterspells than any of these other decks, which is another thing that I want to point out, right? Like you've got 1 Negate, 2 Divide, a Dissipate, which is atypical for this event. 3 Drawer Disruptions, usually it's 2, and then a 1-nub Saw It Coming, and only 1 other player in the event's doing that. So a fair number of main deck counterspells here, which I actually think is fairly wise in this event against the other Epiphany decks and whatnot. But yeah, you've got Goldspan Dragon in here as a threat that makes mana. You know, you've got 4 whole Smoldering Eggs to proc off of all these spells that we're casting. 4 whole Shatter Skull Smashings. I think the list we just looked at plays 2 Shatter Skull Smashing, and a lot of the other Izzet lists don't like play any. So seeing 4 of these is pretty impressive. Really good against mono white, obviously. So, you know, just a slightly different everything old is new again kind of Izzet deck, because we haven't seen this particular build of Izzet Dragons in what feels like a while now, but not long enough that I'm not sick of it still. I'm not sure I said that right, actually. I am still sick of Izzet Dragons. Like, I look at it and I'm like, Izzet Dragons. I've seen it too often at this point, but we'll move on to the deck that, in theory at least, in terms of the data, tends to beat the Izzet Epiphany decks and the Grixis Epiphany decks the most often, and that's mono green. I think this deck is actually really well positioned right now, and I've been saying that for a minute, but this deck usually tends to beat mono white because it goes bigger than mono white, thus, you know, invalidating its creatures and whatnot. Not in every game, but in most games, this deck can go much bigger than mono white. But it also still goes underneath the Grixis and Izzet decks, and that's a really important thing to be able to do right now. So, you know, presents really hot threats. Every card they play is a serious threat. So, and it's something else that I think supports the argument behind mono green right now. And don't think this is a slight of the other players in the event, because, you know, Yellow Hat is Strasky is playing, you know, Izzet. So there's a lot of really good players. Like Sifka is on Izzet. So there's a lot of incredible players that are playing either Grixis or Izzet. But the best Magic players in the world are on mono green in this event. Like, listen to this lineup: Seth Manfield, Paulo Vito Dama de Rosa, and Sam Party. Party Time are all playing mono green, and those are literally 3 of the best Magic players of all time. But we'll look at PBDDR's list real quick. Because it's sort of the more typical list. Seth's list is slightly different. I want to look at the differences, but they're both pretty typical lists for the most part. Like PBDDR's list has the 4 old growth troll. You expect to see that, right? 4 Kazandu Mammoth. You expect to see that. You expect to see a couple of Florahedrons. We've got it. Werewolf Pack Leader, obvious, right? A couple of Wrenn and 7s. You don't always see these, but Esika's Chariot and Wrenn and 7 has become such an important combo in this format that it doesn't surprise me that the mono green decks took a bump off of their speed in order to play this combo. And some of the mono green decks were already playing like Froghemoth in the 5-drop slot. So it doesn't surprise me again that they were able to drop that card, get in Wrenn 7, even though Froghemoth is objectively a faster card. Wrenn 7, especially alongside Chariot, just provides too much value. Just way too much value. The deck plays the 4 Ranger class, the 4 Esika's Chariot, the 4 Blizzard Brawl. I mean, it's a fairly typical list. I think a lot of us could write this list in our sleep at this point, but there's a reason that this list has remained relatively unchanged since like standard 2022, except for the addition of Wrenn and 7 and in this case Primal Adversary, which I think is a great one of in this deck. Also, Snakeskin Veil still in the deck, and then Inscription of Abundance, you could say is a new addition, but we've been seeing this card in mono green since standard 2022, so it's not incredibly new. Not everyone plays it, but I think everyone should. You know, there's always been a problem in mono green where after you cast your Blizzard Brawl or your second Blizzard Brawl, you're kind of out of removal for the game, and your opponent knows that. So Inscription of Removal, I should just call it that. Inscription of Abundance gives you another removal spell that can grow a creature during combat. You know, you grow a trampled creature during combat, get 3 for more damage. Make a creature survive a combat interaction they weren't going to survive. And you trample over, kill their dude, your guy survives, and you fight something else and kill it. So and you gain a bunch of life if you can kick it. And kicking it's not too hard, but even just the 2 mana instant speed fight a thing is good enough in a lot of situations. So there's a lot of spread of use on this card. It's a great option when you top deck it late. It's pretty decent early if you need a removal option. So I'm not surprised to see more inscriptions slowly creeping their way into the deck. We were seeing 2, this one's 3, and I think that's a good call. The mana base is pretty simple, isn't it? 19 Snow-Covered Forest, 4 Faceless Havens, no Lair of the Hydra. I think you could probably safely go down a Snow-Covered Forest and put in a Lair of the Hydra. However, it would be really, really awkward if if you go Lair of the Hydra, Snow-Covered Land, Faceless Haven. Right, like this mana base helps you activate Haven as quickly as possible every single game. So sometimes it's not worth a 1 of Field of Ruin or a 1 of creature land like Lair, because that messes with your consistency just that like 5%, and 5% is a pretty big number. So when you're talking about the World Championships and how much what you want your land consistency to look like. So, and there's going to be turns where you start on a 2-lander, you want to play Old Growth Troll, you draw a Lair of the Hydra on turn 3, and you're like, damn it. So, I get this mana base choice. I absolutely do. I think it's safe. Aside from that, more Snakeskin Veil in the sideboard because, removal exists, and Snakeskin Veil is a ridiculous blowout. Snakeskin Veil wins games by itself. It really is one of the best cards in the deck. It's a 1-mana counterspell that makes your creature even bigger. Just a huge blowout. Snakeskin Veil is so good. Aside from that, Devouring Tendrils, of all things, just another fight effect that can also hit Planeswalkers. Tovolar's Huntmaster, if you're expecting a longer game and you need that value. This can also be pretty good against mono white and stuff. Anytime you want to go white-ish. Tajuru Blightblade. This just has Death Touch. I guess this is against aggro. This I have not been able to figure out. But I assume this is to hold aggro, mono white aggro back in the early game when they're on the play against us. And it probably does that fairly well. So, I'm not going to knock it. Could be pretty good. 3 Froghemoth for when we want to go fast. Outland Liberator to blow up artifacts and enchantments. Another Wrenn and 7 for the value. Inscription of Abundance when we need more fight effects. And then choose your weapon. This can blow creatures with flying up, but it can also just get something through for a bunch of combat damage, super, out of nowhere. So I think it's a cool option, but obviously I don't think mono green has all the best options in the world for sideboard picks. Devouring Tendrils, choose your weapon. These are very interesting picks. I'll leave it at that. Now, Seth Manfield's list is a little bit different. It's still got the Old Growth Trolls, Tangled Florahedron, Werewolf Pack Leader, Kazandu Mammoth. A lot of the cards in this list are the same. Chariot, Blizzard Brawl, Wrenn and 7, Ranger class, blah, blah. But, however, interesting stuff here. Sculptor of Winter is being used in PBDDR's list, and I believe in a Party's list as well. But Seth is using Lotus Cobra instead of Sculptor of Winter. I thought that was an interesting call there. Briar Bridge Tracker is a one-of in this deck, where you don't see it as a one-of in the other decks. A little bit of card advantage, it's just as big as Old Growth Troll. It's got Vigilance, which is important against the mono-white lists, so that's all kind of cool. A copy of Unnatural Growth to explode combat in the late game. Again, pretty good against aggro matchups, and pretty good when you're trying to go underneath these Izzet lists. If they tap out for something, you can throw down Unnatural Growth and just win. Like, out of nowhere, just win. It's actually not a terrible call. 2 Inscription of Abundance for the removal and stuff. But again, there's just some slightly different choices in this list that I really, really like. I think Sculptor of Winter might be better than Lotus Cobra, to be quite honest with you. I really do. But I thought this was an interesting call, and especially if you wanted to splash sideboard counterspells or Decisive Denial, then Lotus Cobra probably would be the card that you'd pick. But aside from that, there's some different stuff in the sideboard. You've still got Devouring Tendril, Snakeskin Veil. No Snakeskin Veil in the main deck for Seth, but 2 in the sideboard. Another Inscription of Abundance, Outland Liberator to Juru Blightblade. Again, I'm assuming that's against mono white. Toski to draw cards in Seth's deck. Tangle Trap in the deck to blow up Essica's Chariots and Flying Dudes. And then an Ashaya Soul of the Wild for reasons. I cannot figure this one out either. I guess if you need a ton of mana or a big guy, I can't with this. Ashaya should be very good. Is there a combo somewhere that I'm missing? Maybe. You tell me. That'll be your mission in the sideboard, or in the the comment section. What's the tech on Ashaya? Because I can't tell you. Now, mono white aggro is the next deck we'll look at, and it's not super well represented at this event, but it is still here, and I think it is still an important archetype in the format to sort of keep certain decks honest, keep certain decks in check. We need a low to the ground aggro deck in this format. Mono white does that the best. So that said, these card choices are pretty much what you would most likely expect from a mono white aggro deck. Yoshihiko Ikawa showed up, and Rei Sato as well to this event with this deck, and they're both very similar lists. You've got the Elite Spellbinders. You expect that. Stonebinder's Familiar, you may not expect, but there's a couple of ways to put stuff into exile in this deck, right? Mostly Sun Gold Sentinel, though, is the big combo with Stonebinder's Familiar. And Sun Gold Sentinel is the best new card for the deck, except for maybe Intrepid Adversary. But Sun Gold Sentinel is our way of getting damage through in the late game. Once we've got Coven, we can sometimes activate this twice if it has to get through, a gold creature or something like that. And we can end up putting a bunch of counters on it with Luminarch Aspirant, just getting through for 5 a turn, and that is some real inevitability that mono white didn't really have before. So this is probably one of the most important new cards, but again, Intrepid Adversary is great too. Just an incredible 4-drop. That can be a decent 3-drop too in mirror matchups and whatnot if you need to trade, keep your life total up when you're on the draw, stuff like that. So there's a lot of cool axes this card plays on, but you get to 4 mana, it's a good 4-drop, and if you flood and get to 6, this kind of protects you from flooding. So a lot of cool things about Adversary too, and I'm not surprised with sort of upgrades like Sentinel and Adversary that the deck specifically needed these 2 cards, these 2 effects the deck really needed. Especially now that it lost things like Selfless Savior, All Seed of Life's Bounty to help get through, All Seed especially, to help get through the last few points of combat damage. Sun Gold Sentinel is very, very good at that, and the deck needed another Anthem effect. And Paladin class wasn't the best Anthem effect, so Intrepid Adversary a lot better. But, it doesn't surprise me to see the other cards. Redain specifically very good in this format. Good in the mirror if you play the shield half of it. And it's obviously great against, all the various and sundry Grixis Epiphany, Izzet Epiphany lists, because the non-creature spells cost more mode is unbelievable. And there's a lot of snow in this format too, so the snow lands enter the battlefield tapped is great too. So just every line of text on Redain is really relevant right now. Obviously Luminarch Aspirants in the deck, Usher of the Fallen is our Savannah Lions, and then Adeline, another brand new card. And I gotta say, I'm a little surprised at this, but I think that this is a lot to do with the event. Normally you see Skyclave Apparition, and I think if you're playing on Arena and trying to get to Mythic or whatever, then it's probably still correct to play Skyclave Apparition, because you're going to come across a lot more aggro, a lot of creatures you got to Apparition away and stuff. But, and the Apparition's good against Chariot and stuff like that. But in this event, I feel like the competitors realized that there wasn't going to be a whole lot of targets for Skyclave Apparition. Now, Apparition can be really good in the mono green matchup. It can also be a liability because your Apparition gets Blizzard Brawled, and then they get, you know, creature back. They killed your Skyclave Apparition. Just that kind of blowout in terms of board presence can lead to a loss. So, you know, again, I guess for this event, I'm not surprised that Adeline got the spot over Apparition, but I would say on Arena, where you play against like way more creatures, even in like the Mythic meta, it's probably, I think Skyclave Apparition is still a ridiculously good card, but Adeline here really helps us go underneath those Epiphany decks. You know, it usually puts a creature in play the turn it comes into play that's tapped and attacking. Another one the next turn, it can get to 4 or 5 power. So it's kind of like our version of Anax from the mono red deck last season. You know, it doesn't leave behind tokens when your creatures die, but it does make tokens while it's on the table. And its power being equal to, you know, the number of creatures you control is kind of similar to power being equal to red devotion pips. So I look at this a little bit like a almost fixed Anax kind of. And even though there's no Embercleave to follow it up with, it's still a really important card in this deck to make sure that you get board presence quickly against these Izzet decks. But aside from that, Portable Hole for mirror matches mostly. But this can also take out, like, you know, tokens against mono green and stuff like that. And then Maul of the Skyclaves is back. You know, we don't play Skyclave Apparition in this deck. And so our 3-drop slot opened up just a little bit. And Maul of the Skyclaves is back on the menu. This is a really, really, really good card right now. I've been surprised that we haven't been seeing more of Maul of the Skyclaves lately, but I guess we all got the menu. We all got the memo. And Maul of the Skyclaves is back. Just a wonderful Magic card. Aside from that, the Fateful Absence shows up in the deck. Again, something else the mono white deck needed. A reliable piece of removal. You know, Skyclave Apparition sometimes sucks. It's just sometimes not a great card. You just get blown out trying to play Apparition. But Fateful Absence is unconditional removal for 2 mana at instant speed, and you do not care if your opponent draws cards, because you're going to kill them. A lot of times you cast Fateful Absence, blow up their blocker, and just kill them that turn, so you really don't care that they got a glue token. Just Fateful Absence is so good. But as far as the lands go, this does the thing I was talking about a second ago. 19 snow-covered plains, 4 Faceless Haven, and a Cave of the Frost Dragon. Now, I should have pointed out that in Seth Manfield's mono green, he is playing 2 Lair of the Hydra. He is doing that along with all the snow-covered lands and Faceless Havens and stuff. And this deck is doing it too. You know, sometimes this will be awkward and you can't attack with Haven on like turn 4 the way you want to, because one of your first few lands was Cave of the Frost Dragon. That's going to feel terrible, but you know, once you flood out, you've got a 3/4 flyer. So that's good. That is very good in a deck like this. Aside from that, the Portable Holes in the board along with Fateful Absence for more removal. Your Ambushed on the Road is actually really sweet. This can save your dudes. That's good. Brutal Cathar. Instead of Skyclave Apparition, Cathar gets the nod in the sideboard again against the aggro matchups. Curse of Silence. Name Alrund's Epiphany is probably what you're doing most of the time. There's the Skyclave Apparition from when we play against other mono white decks most of the time. And then Guardian of the Faith to save our dudes from sweepers, which there are a number of in the format. So pretty straightforward mono white aggro. But there are 2 dark horses at this event. 2 players brought decks that nobody else brought. And they look kind of interesting. Like Jean-Emmanuel Depraz here has brought a deck he's calling Temur Treasures, but don't let that fool you. This is actually just Gruul, like a Gruul aggro deck that splashes blue for negate. That's it. The only blue splash is for 2 main deck negate, 2 sideboard Disdainful Strokes. That's it. That's all. That's it. So, you know, this is typically a Gruul deck. You know, you got Goldspan Dragons, you got your Magdas, along with your Jaspera Sentinels, because combo and all that. Moonveil Regent makes the list. I do like seeing that. It's probably the best card draw tool this deck has. Kind of its great hinge in a way. Or its Experimental Frenzy is probably the better comparison, but I'm going to still say that this is Gruul's version of Hinge. That's the more recently relevant card. Prosperous Innkeeper is pretty obvious, you know. Between Magda and Prosperous Innkeeper, I guess that's where the treasure name comes from. But there's also Reckless Stormseeker, which is a house. I just want to throw out that Reckless Stormseeker is an unbelievable Magic card. For one, it can go ahead and attack for 3 damage the turn that you play it. On the play, that's relatively powerful. And then on turn 4, you can play your Esca's Chariot, and then this can help crew it, right? And then you get in with Esca's Chariot the same turn you played it. So that's really absolutely very sick. It's a sick thing to be able to do with Reckless Stormseeker. I'm surprised more decks aren't playing copies of this card. Shadow Skull Smashing is a 4 of in this deck, plus Ranger Class, Asika's Chariot, Dragon's Fire for removal, and the aforementioned negates. So again, it really doesn't get any more straightforward than this. This is Gruul. This is the same Gruul deck that we've been seeing in spare numbers since the beginning of the season. But things like Stormseeker, Moonveil Regent are really interesting additions to the deck that give it, new dimensions. Reckless Stormseeker makes it play a little bit faster. It gives us this awesome play with Eska's Chariot. And then Moonveil Regent gives us card draw in the late game, which is really sweet. Kind of surprised I'm not seeing any Wrenn and 7, but I guess their 5-drop is Goldspan Dragon here. But still, deck looks interesting to say the least, but we'll see about it. We'll see about it. Maybe it's the secret sauce. Maybe it is. But as far as the sideboard, there's Tangle Trap. We've seen that. Blows up Chariots and Flyers. Burning Hands blows up green creatures. A lot of those to worry about. 2 more Reckless Stormseekers to finish the play set from We Need to Go Fast. Briarbridge Tracker, really sweet creature. Good against aggro, especially because of the vigilance. And helps us draw cards, which is something we need against all decks. Kessig Naturalist for the mana and because, I guess we have a couple of werewolves in the deck, and then Disdainful Stroke as well. What's Kessig Naturalist? I guess mana's good. Mana's good, right? And it's actually, Kessig Naturalist is a really impressive creature a lot of the time. The mana's more important than you might think. But yeah, that's Gruul. I just wanted to quickly touch on Gruul because we've all seen this deck before. I'm just surprised that Depraz has enough faith in it to come to this tournament with it. But maybe he knows something we all don't because he is kind of a genius Magic player. But there is one more player at this event that I want to point out, and I saved maybe my favorite deck for last, and that's Azorius Tempo. Now, I've been working on this myself since the beginning of the season. It's been on the Patreon poll like 3 times, and it almost makes it like every time. But this is actually a really sweet-looking deck. Now, it's just mono white, right? Noriyuki Mori brought mono white, splash blue, but splash blue for like the best stuff you can splash blue for, right? Like Malevolent Hermit, a sweet tempo piece against all kinds of decks, but especially, Epiphany. And you play Hermit on turn 2, and then you can counter their Eska's Chariot on turn 4. You can counter their Wrenn and 7. It's a really sweet card. And then Spectral Adversary to help push through combat damage late, right? There's no Sun Gold Sentinel in this deck, but this is our kind of like our Sun Gold Sentinel because end of turn in the late game, we can phase out like 1 or 2 dudes, especially if we flood, phase out like 2 dudes and just get in for combat damage, partially with Spectral Adversaries. Like, it's a sweet card. It's flying damage in the late game their opponent never sees coming. It also is pretty good in like mirror matches against other aggro decks because you flash it in before your opponent's combat step or during your opponent's combat step, phase their dudes out so they don't deal damage to you, but they also can't block. So just a really sweet application of Adversary here. I really like this. Aside from that, there's also 1 copy of Alrund's Epiphany, which I'm pretty sure this deck can get in a really interesting position to use. Think of Alrund's Epiphany as, a Final Fortune or something like that. Final Fortune is take an extra turn. Something that gives you another combat step effectively. In this deck. It's a really cool application for the card. Is to have a bunch of like small mono white guys on the table and Alrund's Epiphany and get 2 combat steps. That's pretty sick, but they only brought 1 copy. Fading Hope, I really like in this deck. Note that this deck too cuts Skyclave Apparition from both the main and the sideboard. And I think Fading Hope is one of the things it's doing instead of Skyclave Apparition. Just a really sweet tempo piece that can, again, keep your opponent from attacking or pop that thing back to their hand at the end of their turn so that you can attack more profitably. Saves your guys from removal and also gives you a scry. Scrying super important in this aggro deck. So just a huge fan of the Fading Hope pick in this deck. I think it's a really good pick. It's only the 1 mana, so you can play like a 2-drop and hold up Fading Hope on turn 3, and that's really important sometimes. So just a beating of a card, dude. I love this thing. But there's also Drawing Disruption. It can be a land, but it can also, get a little tempo for us to counter their Eska's Chariot or their Alrund's Epiphany. They got too greedy when they tried to cast. So pretty sweet. Also can protect dudes from removal in the early game sometimes. Fateful Absence, removal spell, Concerted Defense, awesome card. Now, like Luminarch Aspirant and Elite Spellbinder are clerics. Malevolent Hermit is a wizard. Legion Angel is a warrior. I haven't even talked about that card. So there's some party types in this deck, but sometimes, especially in the early game, you don't even need a party type guy out. Like, it's always going to make them, it's always going to force spike them. Like a combination of negate and force spike. Force spike that only targets non-creatures. But this, again, even if you don't have like any creatures on the board at all, can sometimes counter that Wrenn and 7, that Eska's Chariot, that Alrund's Epiphany, just whatever they got too greedy right, this can counter that. But if you have like a Malevolent Hermit and a Luminarch Aspirant, suddenly this is just a better mana leak in a lot of ways. So I mean, it can only counter non-creatures still, but you get what I'm trying to say. It's like a 1 mana thing that is like a Mystical Dispute. It's just really, really sick card if you even have like 1 or 2 party types out. But there's a lot of cases where even if you don't, this is just the most mana efficient counterspell in Standard. So just people are tapping out for all kinds of stuff these days. So Concerted Defense just looks better and better. And I think this is another one of the best reasons to add blue to this deck. This looks like a very smart but difficult to pilot deck that's going to run into some problems consistency-wise sometimes, I think. But altogether, I think this is probably my favorite deck at the event. I love decks like this, your sort of aggro tempo decks are some of my favorite. And even though this isn't anything too revolutionary, it's just mono white splash blue for stuff, I do think this was a really interesting way to go. But looking at the sideboard here, by the way, 3 Cave of the Frost Dragon and a Hall of the Storm Giants. This deck is not going to lose to sweepers. I'll throw that out there. But in any case, there's also Portable Hole, Ray of Frost. These are both interesting, like, anti-aggro tech cards. Malevolent Hermit, fill out the playset of that. Fateful Absence for more removal. Alrund's Epiphany, again. Another one of those, in case you're, Time Walk, take an extra combat step plan is especially effective. Why was that so hard to say? And I can understand why this would be actually a really good play in certain situations against other Epiphany decks, right? So, cool call there. Another Concerted Defense to fill out a playset. Legion Angel, 2 more in the sideboard because you got 2 in the main deck, so that makes sense. Loyal Warhound, there's already 1 in the main deck, but this is really good if you're on the draw, which you will be in games 2 and 3 some of the time, obviously. And then Brutal Cathar, again, instead of Skyclave Apparition. In a deck like this, it makes even more sense because we're 2 colors. So you won't always have the 2 white on turn 3 for an Apparition. Brutal Cathar makes more sense in the aggro matchup, so I get that. But altogether, again, this deck isn't super amazing just because it's mono white, splash blue, but easily my favorite deck of the event. It's not trying to do anything super broken, but it is approaching the meta from an interesting standpoint where, it can go underneath Epiphany sometimes, and it can fight Epiphany if the game gets too long for its liking, whereas mono white normally wouldn't be able to do that, but it really didn't sacrifice a lot in terms of its creature slots, its speed, or anything like that. You just lose like Usher of the Fallen. So, I like a lot of what this deck is doing, and I hope that it has a chance at the event. But that's it. We've been here way longer than I thought we were going to be here. It's been 1 hour and 6 minutes, and after I edit it down, this will probably be like 45. So, thanks for staying this whole time if you did. I really appreciate that. These videos where I just talk about like the top 8 or something, they always end up being incredibly long. So again, thanks for staying. I appreciate that. Aside from that, I guess the big question is Alrund's Epiphany from this. And I think I'm going to do a whole separate video where I talk about my thoughts on Alrund's Epiphany. You know what I'm saying? Do we ban it? Do we not? And I'm not even going to give you the quick version of it now, but I'll just say that I don't have a knee-jerk reaction to it. I don't think we should ban it immediately, but I also don't think we should never ban the card. I did a Twitter poll recently where that was the question I asked, right? Do we ban Alrund's Epiphany immediately? Do we ban it after Worlds? See what happens. Do we ban it after Crimson Vow? See what happens. Or do we never, ever ban this card ever? And the 2 most winning options were immediately and never. And neither one of those is my position. So I'm thinking about putting out a whole video about that, but let me know how you feel in the comments section. Ban Epiphany? Don't ban Epiphany. Remember, we don't even have the results from this yet. However, we do know that 10 of the 16 players are on Epiphany. There's like 37 copies of Epiphany or something like that in these 16 decks. So it's a problem, but is it enough of a problem? Is it? Right? But just let me know all your feelings down there in the comment section about these decks, the Epiphany conversation. We'll get back to that later on this week. And yeah, you can do all this stuff if you want to. Now, where is it? It's down here, down there somewhere. In the left-hand corner of your screen. You can watch me play Magic on Twitch if you want to do that. It's fun. We have a lot of fun. You can support the channel for $1 a month on Patreon if you appreciate content like this and want me to keep doing it so I can pay my rent and stuff. It's important. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this kind of a deep dive into this meta. And yeah, just report to me in the comment sections how you feel about all this stuff. And I will catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.